If I could just begin with a few quick thank yous. This event would not have been possible if not for the support of Dean Mary Ingram, also the support of Margaret McDonald, who organized in our department ferociously to make this happen, and then all of that organizational work falls on Ashley McKinnon, who's right there, and who made the event and the reception and to follow possible. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. So St. Mary's University acknowledges that the university is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kma'ki and Wolastoqiyik peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. These treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kma'ki and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. But what the boilerplate here fails to capture is that a majority of us in this room are settlers, and if we are committed to building a just future for all our peoples, our task does not end with acknowledgement, but a commitment to decolonization and undoing the settler projects of annihilation or assimilation of indigenous peoples. We see this struggle still nightly on our news elsewhere in the world, and it should serve as a reminder that the past is not dead and building a just society is the work of many hands. And one requires more than an ounce of faith, and that brings us to the topic of this evening. And on this question of faith, that I'm extremely proud as the chair for the Department of the Study of Religion to welcome Dr. Teresa Morgan. It is hard to offer an introduction to one as hungry for learning as Dr. Morgan. Should one begin with her degrees in musics or classics or perhaps theology, we have before us a prodigy that moves between these three worlds. As an academic, she is currently the McDonald Agape Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity at Yale Divinity School. She formerly held positions at no less prestigious institutions such as Oxford and Cambridge, which I'm told is the correct order to say them in. She is also an ordained priest in the Church of England, and perhaps most importantly for the purposes of our dinner last night, she's an avid fan of Test cricket. Some would say real cricket. An England supporter, but no one's perfect. Books included subjects such as literate education in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds, popular morality in the early Roman Empire, and comparative studies of Roman faith and Christian faith. More recently, the New Testament and the Theology of Trust, and we are now anticipating her latest work, Trust in Atonement, God, Creation, and Reconciliation. If one goes searching for themes, perhaps what's most laudable is that her work is not only interested in looking at history as it's made by the elite and literate classes. It recontextualizes the way that faith was understood in the broader Hellenistic world and explores the relationship between fides and pistis, more often grouped simply under faith. She gives us something profound to contemplate in defining pistis as a relational trust. Curtis Holtzen, a reviewer for Philosophy in Review, distilled her definition of trust as follows: the willingness to put something in someone else's hands on the basis that the other will respond positively. And this naturally leads us to questions which she asks in her books. What do New Testament studies writers think anyone does or should trust in God or in Jesus Christ? What is it like to live in relationship with trust with God and or Christ? What happens when God and Christ put their trust in human beings? These questions give us a sense of the way she unpacks, explores, and prods historical understanding, theological reasoning, and engagement. I cannot tell you how lucky we are to have her here with us. Please remember there is a reception to follow with libation and snacks. And now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Teresa Morgan.
So, as the chair of the department was just mentioning, for over a decade now, I have been interested in the history and theology of early Christian faith, and especially how the understanding and the practice of faith developed from the very beginnings of Christianity to about the 5th century. And I'm just finishing my 4th, and I earnestly hope final book on this topic. Those are the first 3. The last one was out earlier this month. The last final one, nearly done. And that one traces how faith, ideas and practices of faith evolve between the 2nd century and the 5th within Christianity. And some of that project is what I'd like to share with you in the next hour or so. So, faith, as Christians understand it now, faith, la foi, Glaube. It's a complex thing. It includes beliefs that certain things are true about God and Christ and so on, claims to knowledge of the divine. It includes fideism, the leap of faith, mysticism, the eye of faith, trust in God, the content of doctrine, a set of sacraments, obedience to a church and church authorities, practices like prayer, worship, and even good works, and, of course, the faith, Christianity as a whole. But all of that is the result of quite a long evolution. At the very beginnings of Christianity, as far as we can see, faith was simpler, and its centre of gravity was not perhaps quite where it is now. In the languages of very early Christianity, and they were primarily Aramaic and Greek and Latin, the terms that we now translate faith or belief are pistis in Greek, fides in Latin, hamainoutha in Aramaic, which is related to the Hebrew emunah. And I'm focusing on the Greek and the Latin terms today, and actually mainly on the Greek, really, because although the first followers of Jesus, of course, will have been Aramaic speakers with perhaps a little bit of Greek, the language of the earliest Christian writings that survive is Greek, followed by Latin. And in Greek and Latin in general, pistis and fides both have a very wide range of meanings, almost identical, not absolutely identical, but for our purposes, the same range of meanings, which are most commonly and centrally trust, trustworthiness, faithfulness, good faith, but also entrustedness, loyalty, confidence, a pledge, a guarantee, a legal trust or trustee, a proof in rhetoric, and sometimes, though not all that often, belief. And as you would expect, those are all very common concepts with allied practices in everyday life and in literature throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. But one of the remarkable things about very early Christianity is that it adopts pistis as its kind of defining concept, really, and it does that even before the earliest surviving texts are written, and those are written 15 to 20 years after the crucifixion. To give you an idea just how central faith language is in Christian texts of the 1st and 2nd centuries, including all the texts of the New Testament, pistis language is more than twice as common in the New Testament as the language of love, about 6 times as common as the language of righteousness or justice or hope or salvation. It's really absolutely fundamental, and in making it fundamental, Christians are doing something new. However, and this may surprise Christians now, when very early Christians use pistis or a bit later fides language, what they mean by it is not really the whole range of things that we mean by faith now, but actually usually something like trust or trustworthiness or faithfulness, and sometimes entrustedness between God and Christ and the faithful. And the faithful is the early Christian term for themselves. They don't call themselves Christians in the earliest years. They call themselves the faithful. Occasionally, Christians also use faith language to mean something like confidence. Sometimes it's quite closely related to both hope and obedience. And sometimes, though not enormously often, it means belief. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about how Christian pistis and fides evolve from being sort of centred on trust, trustworthiness, faithfulness, entrustedness, to meaning not quite all, actually, but nearly all of the things that we mean by it today. And I haven't got time to talk about all the strands of that development, so we're going to talk about 3. The increasing importance of belief for Christians, the increasing importance of personal and interior faith, and the increasing importance of church-going. So, belief that certain things are true, what philosophers sometimes call propositional belief, is certainly part of Christianity from our earliest sources. And for instance, here's a great example of it at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 15, writing to the Corinthian church, St. Paul says, "I handed on to you what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised, ... So we preach, and so you believed." Now the verb there is pistuein, the verb that's related to pistis. Paul is talking about the content of teaching, and so it makes absolute sense to translate that as believed. So I preached, and so you believed. However, there are signs that for very early Christians, it's not the believing in itself that admits you to the community of the faithful or keeps you there. That is another step, putting your trust, making a whole life commitment and putting your trust relationally in God and Christ. We don't have time to look at a lot of texts that illustrate that now, but I've given you on this handout, and we can return to it later if you like, just a couple of examples. One from Galatians 2, where Paul is talking about how we come to trust in Christ Jesus, and actually one from 1 Thessalonians 2, where he's talking about himself as entrusted by God with preaching the gospel. So those are some other meanings other than the belief meaning. This idea that it is not, that sort of you start as somebody who gets interested in Christianity, you start by believing that certain things are true about God and about Christ, but then what gets you into the community is that sort of self-giving step of trust. I think when we think about it, that is actually very intuitive, and not least because if you think about the world Christianity is evolving in, most people are mainstream polytheists. And if you're a polytheist, you believe that hundreds, if not thousands, of gods exist and have various qualities and do various things. But you don't worship, you don't trust most of those gods. Because, not least, many of them are gods of other cities or other tribes or other families or other places. Or they're just not a god that you need at this moment. They're a god of healing or a god of prophecy or something. You just don't need them now. So you can believe that a lot of gods exist. You can believe in them without worshipping them, without making a commitment to them. Jews can believe in this period all kinds of heavenly beings exist, that Abraham was taken up to heaven, that Enoch was taken to heaven and became identified with the archangel Metatron. You can believe that without worshipping them. You believe all those things about heavenly beings, but you only worship the one God. So there is a difference between belief and worship and commitment, and the word that Christians use for the worship and the commitment is this trust language. So Paul reminds the Corinthians to believe that Christ died and was raised, but when he tells people to commit to God and Christ, he uses pistis language in that relational kind of trust sense. And this is true all across the writings of the New Testament. Pistis language is more often relational than propositional, also in early non-testamental literature too, apocryphal gospels, sayings collections, acts, apocalypses, letters, hymns, prayers, spells, oracles, sermons, all use a lot of pistis language and all overwhelmingly in the relational sense. And another place where we can see the sort of limited, the rather specific role of belief in early churches is in the fact that until at least the mid-2nd century, and maybe the end of the 2nd century, there's no sign that what a person believed could get them thrown out of a community. People could and did disagree about their beliefs. They could call each other heretics. But in the early years, that alone was not enough to get you expelled from your local church. And at that point, there was really no concept of being expelled from the universal church, as it were. You could get thrown out for idolatry or immorality or fermenting discord, rather. I think fermenting discourse is okay. Fermenting discord, not so much. But the first person that we hear about who is claimed to have been expelled from a church for believing the wrong thing is Marcion of Sinope, who got kicked out of his church in Rome in 144. We only know that from Tertullian, who was writing over 50 years later. There's a good chance, actually, some people think Tertullian is being anachronistic, and it's actually closer to his time in the late 2nd century that people begin to be kicked out of individual churches for believing the wrong thing. However, around the mid-2nd century, some writers, Christian writers, begin to talk a lot more about belief. And this happens above all in two contexts. internal wrangles among the faithful, and debates between Christians and outsiders. Now, even here, before the 4th century, when Christians are talking, debating what they believe, they actually don't usually use pistis language, belief language. They normally use the standard Greek and Latin language of thinking and knowing. That's the standard language of debate. If you want to say, I believe that this is the case, if you're a Greek philosopher, you say, I think. So you use, nomidze, doxa, gnosis, phronesis in Greek, putare, noscere, opinio in Latin, that kind of language. No. By the way, interesting little fact here, this is why we talk about orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy. The word for right belief would be orthopisti, which we don't really use. I don't think we use it at all. But we talk about orthodoxy, and that is because orthodoxa is right opinion. And that's belief in the language that people used to talk about belief when Christians were first wrangling about beliefs. It's after the Council of Nicaea that you do begin to find people talking about orthopistis, or vera fides, right belief. So that language does come in, but not until quite a bit later. It's an interesting question why Christians begin to use pistis language of belief at all, actually, given that thinking language is the more common Greek and Latin language for this. And I think there are probably 2 reasons. One reason is what you might call concept creep, which is like mission creep. Pistis and fides language is so important to Christians that over time they apply it to more and more aspects of the faith, including to talk about the faith. And belief is a possible meaning of pistis and fides language in mainstream Greek and Latin, so it's there to be used. But the other reason, which is more interesting really, is that, as you may know, some of the most influential early Christian theologians are strongly influenced by Platonism. And it happens that Plato and his followers used pistis language in an unusual and technical way to refer specifically to beliefs about things in this world which they regarded as highly unreliable, as opposed to knowledge of the metaphysical realm, which is what they regarded as reliable. And so some early Christian writers, as they got increasingly interested in Christian beliefs, picked up this Platonic usage and started talking about Christian belief as pistis, although they abandoned Plato's own idea that belief in that sense was always in something unreliable. They thought belief was reliable. But just to give you an example of this, Justin Martyr, born in about 100 CE in Samaria. As a young man, he explored various schools of philosophy, including Platonism, and eventually converted to Christianity, apparently on the basis that it was the best philosophy for life that he had discovered. And he worked as a Christian teacher and apologist in Rome and was martyred there in about 165. And in the 150s, he composed an apology addressed to the Roman emperor, optimistically. Don't suppose the emperor read it, but anyway. He was defending Christians against accusations that they were immoral, disloyal to the emperor, and above all, irrational. That was an accusation that really bugged early Christian leaders. Now, Justin usually talks about Christian beliefs using that standard Greek language of thinking and knowing, but just occasionally he uses pistis language, and when he does, he uses it like Platonists used it in his day, to suggest that there are this worldly bases on which it is rational to believe in God and Jesus Christ. And so, for instance, on this slide, which I hope you can just about see, although the lights are bouncing off it a little bit, he says, we have received, in his apology, we have received by tradition that God does not need the material offerings that human beings can give because he himself provides us with everything. We have been taught and persuaded and believe, that's the pistis word, that God accepts only people who imitate the good things which pertain to God, temperance, justice, and the other virtues. And later in the chapter he says, in order that we may follow those things that please God, choosing them by the powers of reason which he has given us, he persuades us and leads us to pistis. So the idea that we follow God by deploying the reason that God gives us and imitating God's virtues and that we know how to do that thanks to the teaching we've received. That's all actually good mainstream Middle Platonism. Justin never says exactly what he means by Christian pistis, but by linking it with teaching and persuasion, he implies that it is the outcome of those things, teaching and persuasion. So it is something cognitive, it's some kind of belief. 2 generations later, Clement of Alexandria takes even more interest in pistis as belief. Now, he was another adult convert to Christianity who had studied philosophy, Platonism, before he converted, and he spent most of his life teaching in the second half of the 2nd century in Alexandria. And he is deeply interested in the relationship between pistis, faith and reason, and knowledge of God, which was his great aim. In his view, the thing that Christians long for above all is relational knowledge of God. And in service of this aim, he develops a multi-stage theory of pistis. So he says, going back to the authoritative text, Clement, by the way, is the first person that we know of to refer to the Old Testament and the New Testament, though the contents of his New Testament are not quite the same as ours. But he says, looking back at the text of the New Testament, pistis can be a basic attitude of trust. And that works even for people who are not very intelligent or very educated. You can trust in God and be saved. And it is important to him that everybody can trust in God and be saved. However, people who are intelligent and educated can also see things that are evident to reason and respond to them with pistis in the sense of belief. So, for instance, Clement says, when people encounter the word of God in Jesus Christ, say in the Gospels, then they are encountering something that is self-evident to reason, and they respond with pistis in the belief sense. And that kind of belief makes further rational thought possible. So then we begin to understand something about God. We begin to be able to judge the truth of claims that are made about God. And that leads us to a higher level of pistis, which is the kind of belief that we have in the truth of something that has been proven to us. And that ultimately leads us, says Clement, to knowledge of God. So that's a very short summary of rather a complicated scheme that Clement develops. But there are 2 things about it interesting for us, really. First, Clement makes by far the most sustained early Christian attempt to synthesize philosophy and Christian faith. And in the process, he makes belief really central to it, at least for the educated. You ascend through belief to knowledge of God. And secondly, he really works to apply this theory to authoritative Christian texts, and above all to Paul, of whom he was a big fan. And so Clement really marks the beginning of people reading Paul's letters as being about belief rather than about trust. And if you read modern English translations, you will find a lot of the faith language still translated as belief rather than trust. So Clement marks a new kind of high in the philosophication of Christianity. But later writers, and notably Origen of Alexandria, adds a little bit to his theory. Clement is the person who really establishes this idea that belief is central to Christians. But Origen does add a little bit, and I'll just mention one thing which I particularly like that Origen says about this. He wrote a book in the mid-3rd century against Celsus, which is a defense of Christianity against a Greek polytheist philosopher called Celsus. And Origen argues there that Christians ought to be able to prove the believability of their teachings. He thinks that's, any rational person would want to be able to do that, and he thinks that they can. And one way that they prove the believability of Christian teaching is by pointing to the excellent consequences of becoming Christian. So he says, for instance, we can believe in the incarnation because it has such a beautiful effect on the character. It implants a wonderful meekness and tranquility and love of humanity and kindness and gentleness. How I wish that were true, Anyway, he'd like to believe that. Possibly it was true of him, no. Anyway, in these writers, sort of interactions with non-Christians and particularly Greek philosophy push Christian thinkers towards defending the belief in the plausibility of their truth claims about God and about Christ, and therefore push them towards thinking that belief is central to Christian faith. There is another field of conflict pushing some people in the same direction, and that's disputes between Christians about their understandings of God and Christ. And I mentioned a minute ago that the first person we hear about getting thrown out of a church for believing the wrong thing was Marcion of Sinope, according to Tertullian. Now, Tertullian normally uses fides language. He's writing in Latin. He normally uses fides language in the mainstream Latin sense of trust or loyalty. But occasionally, and usually when he's talking about Marcion, we find him invoking a more propositional understanding of fides, and especially in his monumental 5 books against Marcion. Because Marcion, in Tertullian's view, holds wrong views about God. So Marcion thought that the God of the Hebrew Bible could not be the same as the God of New Testament. They behave so differently. So he thinks there are 2 gods, a high God and a demiurge. Most Christians not keen on being 2 gods. Also, Marcion was a Docetist. He thought that Christ was a heavenly being, but not in any way human. And on both those scores, Tertullian doesn't like him. So Tertullian says that the light of Marcion's faith, the thing that ought to guide him to God, is what he thinks is true about God and Christ. And that, as an idea, that the light of your faith is what you think is true about God and Christ, makes right belief important to fides, not necessarily the same thing as faith. But in a book called On the Flesh of Christ, Tertullian goes even further, and he says, Marcion thinks that it is irrational to think of God through Christ as taking on human flesh. But Tertullian says this is only irrational in human reason. And he appeals to 1 Corinthians 1, the wisdom of God is wiser than human wisdom. And to become wise in God's terms, you have to become a fool to the world. This is the context in which he famously says, the Son of God died. It is all by all means to be believed because it is impossible. Famous dictum. He's not saying there that fides belief means non-rational belief. What he's saying is that the wisdom of God is bigger than human wisdom. The reason of God is bigger than human reason. And so we have to believe what is preached to us, what is taught. We have to take it on trust, effectively. And he concludes his argument against Marcion by saying, you, Marcion, do not believe what, by being believed, makes people Christians. And at that point, Tertullian is absolutely identifying being Christian with believing that certain things are true. So in all these examples, we can see various pressures on Christians, but also their own interests and the people they're talking to, all kind of pushing them increasingly to thinking of pistis and fides more often in terms of belief than in terms of trust and faithfulness. And among other things, that takes us to an interesting point by, say, the end of the 3rd century, where kind of Christian trust is seen as the basis for belief. You start off by trusting, teaching, trusting God, and then you develop beliefs and convictions, and with any luck you end up with knowledge of God. I think Paul would have turned in his grave had he foreseen this development, because for Paul, belief is a basis for trust, and trust is the thing that saves you. By the time we get to Origen and to the beginning of the 4th century, trust is a basis for belief, and belief is the thing that saves you. Interesting kind of switch. But for belief to be really, really institutionalized in Christianity, as opposed to an idea of certain Christian teachers, one more thing has to happen, and that is the Council of Nicaea in 325 and the creation of the Nicene Creed, which we are not going to get into in any detail here. Many of you will know a lot about it anyway, but you will probably know that the earliest creeds develop as baptismal affirmations, and probably affirmations of trust in God and Christ and the Spirit, and they are taught to catechumens alongside summaries of the teaching of the faith and summaries of the Bible and so on. But the Nicene Creed was not a teaching tool, and it was not a baptismal creed. It was not created to be part of a liturgy at all, and it wasn't used in liturgy for over 100 years after Nicaea. The Nicene Creed was uniquely created as a tool to test whether people who were accused of heresy believed in the right things. And that means that 325 was the first point when the Universal Christian Church, at its first Universal Ecumenical Council, affirmed that the thing that makes you a Christian and keeps you in the church is above all what you believe, in the sense of what you think is true about God, about Christ, about the incarnation, about salvation, so on. And that development has been enormously influential in Christianity to the present day. As a last word about the development of belief before we move on, I might just share what is perhaps one of the very strangest stories about the Desert Fathers of late antique Egypt, which captures the importance of orthodoxy or orthopisty after Nicaea in very dramatic terms. And I should perhaps, in the current environment, give a trigger warning here. This is quite a violent story. It really is quite a violent story. If that is a concern, then listen away for a minute now. But this story comes from a saying of Abba Daniel, and it's about an elderly monk of the 4th century who, it was rumoured, did not believe that the bread and wine of the Eucharist were truly the flesh and blood of Jesus Christ. And when 2 other monks heard this, they visited him in his cave to tell him that he was wrong. Catholic teaching is that the bread and wine are body and blood. So they prayed together for a week, and at the end they celebrated the Eucharist. And as the table was prepared, a child miraculously appeared beside it. And then an angel descended from heaven with a sword and cut the child into pieces, and put a piece of his flesh on the plate and poured his blood into the cup. I can think of quite a lot of things I might have said at that point, none of them very religious. However, the old monk cried out, "Lord, I believe." And immediately the flesh and blood turned into bread and wine, and he was saved. So, power of belief. So that is something about the development of belief. And next, I want to turn to another really remarkable development in Christian understandings of faith between the 2nd and the 5th centuries. And this is the growth of Christians' sense of their interior life of faith, and in particular, the imagery that they use of this interior life. I have a theory about early Christianity. It's not really demonstrable, but it's a sort of pet theory, and this is that compared with other religious traditions in its world, it doesn't really give worshippers in the early years quite enough to do. You know, if you are a mainstream polytheist in this world, then you worship a lot of gods, and that means you've always got something to do. Every day of the week you've got an offering to make, a prayer to say, a festival to go to. You're busy. There's stuff to do. If you're Jewish, you keep the law, and you keep the law, theoretically at least, every day, so you always know that you're Jewish. If you're Christian, you're told you're supposed to pray all the time, but nobody's really checking. I leave that to your individual conscience. But also, I mean, you might meet once a week to share a Eucharist, to share a love meal. But in this world, how do you know that you're Christian on a Wednesday? This is what I want to know about the early years. And I think one thing that Christians did to answer that question was to develop a very lively sense of their interior life of faith. And they describe this using a really very remarkable range of language, of images. So from the very beginnings of Christianity, faith is imagined as a very dynamic thing. One of the most cited sayings of Jesus is that faith has the power to move mountains, okay, from the Synoptic Gospels. So it's a dynamic thing. But in general, the early language of faith is not very imagistic. But from the sort of later 2nd century, we begin to find a steady increase in imagery for faith, which explores kind of what it is and what it does. And to start, given that faith has always been understood as about healing or release from sin, it is perhaps not surprising that quite a lot of this imagery is medical. It's about healing or about purification. So John Chrysostom, for instance, great preacher of the later 4th century, very fond of the idea that faith is a medicine. He calls it the medicine of salvation in many sermons. He can even talk in very literal terms about going to church as being like going to the pharmacy to get your pills. And in that kind of imagery, faith is explicitly a gift from God. God gives out the pills. And that's an idea that goes right back to Paul, to 1 Corinthians 12, where pistis is a Greek gift of the Spirit, to Galatians 5, where it's a fruit of the Spirit. Faith can also be described as a foundation, the foundation of your life, on which your life or the whole church is built. So, for instance, the 2nd century Apocalypse, the shepherd of Hermas, the main character Hermas is given a vision of the church as a tower which is in the process of being built. And the whole structure is supported by 7 virtues, and the first and most important of these is faith, because the church herself says to Hermas, through faith the chosen of God are saved. So faith is the literal foundation of the tower of the church. For other writers, faith can lift you up from earth to heaven. There's a collection of 2nd century gnomic sayings about all sorts of things, ethical Christian sayings called the Sentences of Sextus. One of those says that faith elevates the soul from earth to God. Clement of Alexandria calls faith a ship's rope by which we haul ourselves up to God. Slightly Pelagian idea before Pelagius, you know. All of those are images of kind of faith getting us from earth to heaven. But actually, most of these images of faith and the life of faith are really about how faith works in this life. And the reason that we're looking at this slide is that the most common image of faith in this era is that faith is a ship which carries the faithful across the turbulent seas of life, bearing them up, weathering storms, and eventually landing them in safe harbour in heaven. And what we're looking at here is a Christian tombstone for a young woman from the 4th century, and that's why this is what is on the tombstone. The ship is sailing through the choppy seas of life. The thing on the right-hand side is a lighthouse, good Roman lighthouse, very square with a fire at the top. And so the sea is coming into safe harbour in heaven, and that's why that's on this tombstone. Here's a ship of faith scratched onto the wall of a catacomb. You might think that the ship that we sail in would be the faith, would be Christianity as a whole, or the church, but it actually almost never is. It's almost always the individual's faith. So you're sailing your own faith into safe harbour. And I've given you here on the slide a wonderful quote from Tertullian from his work on idolatry, where he says, amid the reefs and the inlets of vice, the shallows and straits of idolatry, faith navigates, her sails filled with the Spirit of God, safe if cautious, secure if intently watchful. But for those who are washed overboard, there is a deep there is no swimming out of. Those who run aground suffer inescapable shipwreck. For those who are engulfed, every wave suffocates and every eddy sucks one down into hell. I got taken to Peggy's Cove this morning. So I have a particularly vivid mental image of this just now. Anyway, so sea-based metaphors, of course, very important in the ancient world. For those who think of their spiritual journey as more land-based, though, the 4th century Spanish poet Prudentius says in his poem The Psychomachia that faith weaves new clothes for the baptized, for hearts that are cleansed by baptism as they set out on their journey of faith, overland, apparently. Other people say that faith lights you on your way, strengthens the hearts of the faithful when they're afraid. And as we travel, some people talk about faith having other roles in our lives. It's often a nurturing or a comforting presence. So you find references to alma fides, nurturing faith. Now that's a pre-Christian Roman phrase, quite a common phrase, but it's adopted by Christians. Nurturing faith helps you on your journey through death, and that's why it appears on tombstones. Ambrose of Milan, in one of his beautiful evening hymns in the 4th century, talks about watchful faith with cooling care, soothing our fevered brows as we fall asleep at the end of the day. In more extreme situations, faith can do even more for you. So Prudentius, again in the Psychomachia, talks about faith as he personifies faith. And he talks about her as like a kind of a small goddess who comes into your mind and your heart, and she fights your vices for you from the inside. So your faith is fighting your vices in a kind of personified way. A whole lot of people, Tertullian, Paulinus of Nola in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa, Augustine, all talk about faith as going into battle on behalf of the faithful. And sometimes they talk about her as being alongside the person and sometimes as inside the person. There's an extraordinary sermon by Peter Chrysologus, who was Bishop of Ravenna in the mid-5th century, and he's describing, this is a sermon for the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, and he's describing St. Lawrence's death on the gridiron, which is clearly a horrible death. But as Peter tells it, it's almost kind of made bearable by the presence of faith. So he says somebody brought out the gridiron to martyr Lawrence by roasting him, but his faith was not burning painfully in him. This is the highlighted bit. It was even consoling the man who was being roasted. Why was faith consoling him? Because it was keeping him faithful to the one making the promises to God. So their faith is apparently sort of alongside Lawrence, taking his pain away. And for Prudentius, again, in another poem called the Harmatigania, when the souls of the faithful finally reach heaven, whether martyred or not, faith will be there like Abraham, and like Abraham, you will rest on her bosom. And she'll sit there kindly like a sort of grandmotherly figure while you unload all your griefs onto her. So he says, as the exiled soul returns to be instated in the heavenly country, white-haired Fides receives the soul, that is, to her bosom and comforts her nursling with tender affection, while the soul plaintively describes the many toils she has endured since she took up lodging in the flesh. Yet another popular cluster of images for faith sees her as a guide and a teacher. And there's a wonderful, very famous early example of this from a 2nd century tombstone, very elaborate tombstone which survives, to a man called Abercius of Hierapolis in Asia Minor in modern Turkey. And he was apparently an elder or a bishop of his church, and at some point he got to go on pilgrimage to Rome. And his tombstone describes this, evidently the highlight of his life, I think. He got to go to Rome, he looked at a queen with golden robes and golden shoes, that's the church, and everywhere, he says, pistis, faith, led the way. Everywhere she fed me with fish from the spring, great and pure, caught by a holy maiden. Not totally sure what the fish from the spring are, but plausibly Christian teaching, perhaps. And by the late 4th century, one of the most significant things faith does is to create and to train the inner eye, and sometimes a whole set of inner senses, by which the faithful are enabled to understand the mysteries of the faith, and especially things like the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And exactly how the eye of faith works is beyond us this evening, but 4th century writers all agree that it is faith that helps it to develop. So we've got images that show faith saving us, changing us, building us up, equipping us, carrying us safely through life, supporting us, comforting us, relieving suffering, teaching, guiding, training our inner eye, one way and another, getting us safely to heaven. Vividly shows just how important faith is, but also how people are encouraged to imagine their own faith as this kind of dynamic force at the centre of their lives, doing all these things for them. And then life itself as a kind of perilous journey or a battle or possibly a major building project or a project of self-transformation, in all of which faith is fundamental. And all of that makes faith extraordinarily precious. And nobody captures that better than the 4th century Syrian writer Ephraim the Syrian in his copious and wonderful hymns to faith. And so Ephraim talks about faith as the pearl of great price, which a merchant offers everything he has to own. Its faith, he says, is a peeled grape. It is the most luxurious thing that a vine dresser can offer his master. Faith is a bride, should be carried triumphantly through the marketplace. It's a trumpet which you blow to celebrate. It's the most precious thing in your life. Now, I think the drama of these images, doesn't need to blind us to the fact that for most Christians, most of the time, life is probably not that dramatic. Probably not that dangerous, especially by the 4th century when they're no longer being persecuted. I wonder whether that in itself is actually one reason why this faith imagery develops so much. It creates a kind of a mental set in which everyday life is this drama in which all the faithful take part. And it has also a very definite theological payoff, especially when faith is personified, because when faith is personified, it is always sort of specified as the faith that comes from God. And personified faith comes to be described as doing many of the things that God and Christ and the Spirit do. And so in Prudentius's hymn, again for the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, Prudentius describes how at Lawrence's martyrdom, Fides fought in arms, not sparing her own blood, for by death she destroyed death, and spent herself to save herself. And in that description, faith's action is unmistakably reenacting the saving death of Christ. The phrase, by death she destroyed death, goes back to 2 Timothy. And so Fides now is being imagined as the force that continues Christ's work on earth. And that is quite typical of personifications of faith. They imagine faith as the ongoing form of God's presence with the faithful. As the Spirit is, as the ascended Christ is, but increasingly through this period, faith herself is the sign of God's presence with the faithful. So, by having faith, the faithful have God, and God has them, and they get safely to heaven. And we could go on all day with these images. There is just such a wealth of this imagery. I haven't even mentioned that faith is a baby bird and a sweet scent and the kingdom of heaven itself. However, before we finish, I would just like to mention one more way in which faith evolves in this period. And that relates to churches, church buildings, and church going. And when we turn to churches, church building and church going, I think that we can see not so much an evolution in Christian ideas of faith as really a genuine revolution. And it takes place with Constantine in the early 4th century. From the earliest Christian writings, Christians think about faith, as we have begun to see, in a great many different contexts. But although we hear from very early on about gatherings of the faithful in houses, out of doors, sometimes in purpose-built church buildings and in other places, early Christians almost never connect pistis, faith language, with places of worship. Even more remarkable in a way, in the early centuries, they never, that I know of, connect faith language with places of worship in positive terms. In fact, there are indications that they go out of their way to segregate them. So, for instance, Clement of Alexandria in the late 2nd century, in his book on the Exhortation to the Greeks, he says, Christ builds his temple in people, so that he may set up the shrine of God in people. So purify yourself to receive God. That's an idea that goes back to Paul, of course, in 1 Corinthians. But it also tells you don't need a special building to practice your faith in. And this is really a theme of early Christian writing. You don't need a building. You meet Christ in your heart. This is what they always say. You meet Christ in your heart. It's a very nice thing if the faithful get together to pray together. Origen, in his book on prayer, has this wonderful image of how when the faithful get together to pray, the saints and the angels muster above them in ranks and ranks above them, so that all the beings of earth and heaven pray together. But he doesn't say anything about where you do it. It doesn't matter where you do it. The important thing is that the faithful are together. One of the 2nd or 3rd century Odes of Solomon, Jewish Christian collection of hymns, borrows a line from Psalm 84, "One day in your courts is better than 1,000 years elsewhere," but changes it to say 1 hour of your pistis, 1 hour of your faith is better than all days and years. Nothing to do with buildings at all. It is maybe not that surprising if communities which are being periodically persecuted, they did have some designated, some intended church buildings in the early centuries, but we only ever hear about them when they've been vandalized or burnt down or looted, And so, Christians before Constantine don't have a lot of incentive to invest a lot in buildings, either materially or, frankly, theologically. And they don't. But the 4th century sees a really dramatic change in that. Because after Constantine declared universal religious toleration in the Edict of Milan in 313, and of course regarded Jesus Christ as his own personal patron, and Christians began not just to be tolerated but favoured, Christians immediately capitalised on this and started to build new, big, beautiful, elaborate, celebratory churches, cathedrals, sanctuaries of all kinds. And suddenly, at the same time, we find a wealth of writing connecting faith with place in highly positive terms. And there is a wonderful example of this in the ecclesiastical history of Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea. Because in about 315, Bishop Paulinus of Tyre, on the coast of Lebanon, celebrated the dedication of a great big new cathedral which he had built for himself and his flock at Tyre, symbolically on the footprint of an earlier church which had been burnt down. And he invited Bishop Eusebius from nearby Caesarea to speak at the consecration, and Eusebius gave what, if his preservation of it is right, was an awfully long sermon, which he preserves in his ecclesiastical history in Book 10. And he calls the cathedral God's house on earth, and that is a new idea for Christians. But he goes further than that. He says, it is no longer by hearing the spoken word of the gospel that people learn about the power and the might of God. We can now see it with our own eyes, that the traditions of the past were trustworthy and true, pista kai aletheia. Because this church of the living God is a pillar and foundation of truth. By this church, God has proven the record of the ancient narratives, the scriptures, trustworthy, foretelling the humbling of the mighty and the exalting of the humble. The mighty in this case being polytheists and the humble being Christians. And God has done this not only for the faithful themselves, but for unbelievers too, the unfaithful, hoi apistoi. So for Eusebius, this elaborate building is the confirmation that Christians have been waiting for, that Christian faith is justified. And what is more, the building itself, he says, creates faith, or at least it creates the conditions for faith in those who are not yet Christians. So he describes how a great gateway to the outer enclosure of the church gives a clear view into the precincts right from the street. And this, he says, has the effect of turning the gaze, even of strangers to faith, inescapably to the building, so that no one can hurry past without having his soul mightily struck by the miracle that this building is. And by this means, he explains, the Bishop of Tyre hopes to impel non-Christians to have their steps turned purely by the sight of it towards the entrance to the church and the entrance to the faith. So in this speech, the work of bringing people to faith and strengthening the faithful in their faith, which has historically been performed by preaching, miracles, scripture, tradition, and example. All that work has been taken on by the church building. The building is doing what prophets and preachers and exemplary people have always done. And Eusebius then goes on to describe how the cathedral and the faithful as a community are mirror images of each other. And then he goes on to describe how moving through the cathedral building itself mirrors the development of people's faith. And by the way, here's a little interesting footnote. Some of you will know that the leaders of the Oxford movement in Oxford, England, in the early 19th century were deeply interested in patristics and in the church fathers, and read them and learned a lot from them and used a lot of them. John Henry Newman, future Cardinal Newman, founded a little church in a village on the edge of Oxford in 1836, which happens to be the church where I served for 20-odd years when I lived in Oxford. And he preached a sermon in this newly built church when it was consecrated, in which he talked about the church as preaching to the local community. And he had got that straight out of Eusebius because of his interest in patristics. And it went on to be an idea that was then much cited through the 19th century, the idea that the church as a great, beautiful building is itself a preaching and a teaching tool. Okay. Well, Eusebius also refers to this cathedral at Tyre as God's house. And that signals a different development, a second development really in thinking about churches. Because throughout the 4th century, people increasingly represent churches as the places, not just places, but the places above all, where God and Christ are encountered. Now you remember a minute ago I said in the first 3 centuries, what Christians always said is you meet Christ in your heart, you do not need a place. And if you don't have a place, it doesn't matter. No. In the 4th century, they started saying you meet Christ in church. By the 5th century, bishops are routinely saying to their congregations, the church is the only place where you meet Christ, and that is why you have to come to church on a Sunday. That's the beginning of that discourse, which we are still with today. You know, it is highly understandable. They've built these enormous, very beautiful, very elaborate, very expensive buildings, and then as now, they wanted people to fill them. You know. Then as now, it was not always easy. You know. So hence a lot of sermons saying you have to come to church. But in seriousness, that is also, a very remarkable reversal of this early theology, which said that you meet Christ in your heart and you don't need a building, But because of that, because it is a reversal, towards the end of the 4th century, we also find some prominent theologians objecting to this new enthusiasm for churches. Jerome and Gregory of Nyssa are 2 powerful voices who do not like this new enthusiasm for churches. So, for instance, Jerome, writing to Bishop Paulinus of Nola in about 395, has a real attack on this widespread assumption that Christians need buildings. He says, that's what the pagans need. Pagans need buildings. Christians do not need buildings. You encounter God in the true temple of Christ is the soul of the faithful person. Adorn your soul, clothe your soul, offer gifts to your soul, welcome Christ into your soul. What use are walls blazing with jewels, by which he probably means mosaics, when Christ in his poor is in danger of dying of hunger? Gregory of Nyssa very much agreed with that view. Neither of them believed in going on pilgrimage either for the same reason. It's not place that matters, You can meet Christ just as well at home as in Jerusalem. This despite the fact they were both, of course, extremely well-travelled themselves. Gregory says in one letter, well, of course, I've been to Jerusalem, but it don't make any difference to my faith. Fine. As far as we know, nobody took any notice of Jerome or Gregory on this. The association of faith with place became very entrenched very quickly. We have a wonderful, some of you will know this, a wonderful account of a pilgrimage from the late 4th century, which really testifies to this. And this is the account of a nun called Egeria, probably from Spain or southern France, who in perhaps the 380s, we're not quite sure, made a pilgrimage to the Near East and to the Holy Land. And she wrote an account of her travels for her fellow nuns back home, much of which survives. And she describes how faith prompted her to go on pilgrimage and how her faith was deepened by all the sights she saw. And in one long passage, she describes being in Jerusalem during Holy Week and attending all the services, which at that time in the late 4th century were peripatetic. So the bishop would conduct services at all the places in Jerusalem where the events of Holy Week happened, and the faithful would follow him around. And she says how people are immensely emotionally caught up in this. They groan, they weep, they lament as they listen to the narrative of Jesus' betrayal on the Mount of Olives. They're moved by all the readings. They weep on the sight of the crucifixion. She said you'd hardly believe how moved people are by this. And it is, I think, the earliest sustained description we have of the power of place and liturgy combined to develop a kind of emotional faith response in worshippers. And once that idea was established that you meet Christ in church, some writers develop it even further to think about what happens to you when you go to church. So in the mid-4th century, Bishop Cyril of Jerusalem used to give catechetical lectures to people who were going to be baptized at Easter, did it through the last few weeks of Lent. And in the first of these lectures, he warns the catechumens that they should not expect, when they've been baptized, they should not expect to go into church for the Eucharist for the first time saying, now we're finally going to find out what the faithful do at the Eucharist. No. He says, do you expect to see and not be seen? God will be searching you. And then in a later lecture he says, Christ will be present with the faithful, observing the way that each person behaves and presents themselves and the firmness of their faith. So for Cyril, a church is not a place where you go to satisfy your curiosity. It is not a place where you're in control. It is a place of mystery, of divine encounter, but because of that, of risk and of change. It creates this kind of unique environment, which is both safe because God is there, Christ is there, and radically unsafe because being faithful is now only the beginning of your divine encounter. And I'll mention just one more thing before I end. Early hymns and prayers are a great source of writing about the development of the sort of interior and emotional dimensions of early faith. And occasionally they also sketch a picture of worship in churches. And in his long, very literary hymn for the lighting of the lamps, Prudentius captures something of the experience of being in church during a night liturgy and looking up at all the lamps hanging from the roof. So the hymn is a prayer to Christ to restore light to the faithful at dawn. And it describes how we pass the long night with pious gladness in festal congregations. In sleepless prayer, we earnestly heap up petitions that will be granted, and on the high altar make offerings to God. The lamps gleam out, hanging by swaying cords from every panel of the roof, and the flame, fed by the oil on which it floats lazily, casts its light through the clear glass. And looking up to the ceiling is like looking up at the sky itself and all the stars. And then the poem goes on to say how this experience inspires the faithful to new thoughts and new praise of God. So the church itself is an expression of gratitude for creation. It acts as an image of creation, the night sky, and it embodies God's pledge, his fides, that light will come again. And there, the church building itself has come to embody the assurance of salvation. Well, so in the last hour or so, I've tried to give you a flavour of just some of the ways that early Christian faith developed between the 1st and the 5th centuries. And by that point, almost all the aspects of modern faith were in place. And there is much more we could have talked about. We could have talked about the development of the eyes or the mind of faith. We could have talked about the development of socially specific forms of faith, for instance, for women and enslaved people. We could have talked about how Christianity as a whole comes to be called the faith. But I'll just finish with a reflection on how studying the history of faith might help us think about its nature today. Because it's a strong tradition in the church that through time our understanding of the faith steadily progresses. But history can also remind us of aspects of the tradition that we've sometimes forgotten, which have sometimes fallen out of common use, but which may enrich us when we recover them. One of those, I think, is the importance of trust, relational trust and faithfulness and trustworthiness and entrustedness at the roots of the tradition. Very, very important in New Testament writings, gradually kind of fell out of central importance in later centuries. Another aspect of early Christian faith we might enjoy recovering is this idea that faith kind of accompanies us through life, and not only as something that we affirm and guard and strive for, but also as a power that affirms and guards and strives for us. Faith within us, beside us, encouraging us, teaching us, leading us, consoling us, as we make our sometimes perilous journey through the turbulent seas of our own lives. Thank you.
I'm going to be talking about like early faith. It seems that it was more of he accepts solely those who imitate good things, routine, and temperance, justice, and philanthropy. I know those are things that are spoken about in the church today, but I feel like they aren't touched on as much as more of just the belief in God and Jesus Christ, his son. So I was just wondering what you thought about that. If the earlier faith was more of a moral compass than it has grown to be now.
Well, some of that early imagery that I was talking about does talk about faith as kind of guiding us morally. Yeah. I think the most important early aspect of faith that has the slightly, well, up to a point become less important in the tradition is the sort of relational trust. And it's a very interesting thing about that in a way it's never fallen out of the understanding of, in a sense, the regular Christian in the nave, the regular churchgoer. If you go online, you can find lots of popular books with things like, God is trustworthy and, trusting God and this kind of thing. But it's fallen out of theology. There's virtually no theology of trust in the way there are masses and masses of theologies of faith. It's the complex concept of faith and fideism and hope and salvation, and also love and all sorts of other things. So I think it's that kind of relational trust related kind of aspect of it that is the most important early aspect of faith that has fallen out a bit. And I think faith is not itself, it comes to be called a theological virtue. A theological virtue is a bit of a fudge concept. It means a virtue. It means a concept that was understood as a virtue in the ancient world, but we now think of theologically and not really ethically, actually. But it is an ethic in the mainstream Greek and Roman world. So being faith, not so much having faith, but being faithful itself is an ethic, and personified faith guides you ethically. Yeah, for sure. And I think that's also, is an interesting aspect of it, worth being reminded of by this material, I guess. Yeah.
You mentioned that the evolution of pistis and fideis language went from a kind of more solid, trust-based language into a personal belief kind of language. But inversely, the Christian faith evolved from what I understood as starting as being internal and then being externalized and validated, kind of being proven by the grandness of churches. I just kind of wanted to understand why that seems to be the inverse, and why there seems to be, because I've heard the belief that older Christian faith perceived heaven as an internal state, whereas it is more often described as an actual physical place that the soul travels to. Kind of what is the relationship between this almost opposite flip of seeing faith as an internal thing, but also based in reason, and then having it reasoned by something external while thinking belief is just, and pistis and fideis is internal?
Well, it has, I think, both sort of internal and external, as it were, aspects from the beginning. So it can be something that you have individually. It can be from very, very early, already in later New Testament writings, the faith means the body of teaching that is handed down. So it can be that body of teaching. It doesn't quite mean sort of the religion as a whole in the modern sense, in antiquity, I think, at any point. But it can mean a body of teaching very early. It can also be the bond that creates community very early. Paul uses it in a sense that it probably means something like the bond of trust that creates a community. So faith has a number of dimensions already in early texts, many of which focus on the relational, some of which are internal, some of which are more about the relationship between communities, what forges community, and one of which at least is to do with the body of teaching. So it's not so much that it starts internal and becomes kind of external, as just that it adds meanings, some of which become kind of more dominant in the tradition. And so the faith as the body of teaching, the faith as belief, the faith as the tradition as a whole, as it were, which are more kind of external things, become more important through time, I guess. On heaven, ideas about heaven which are really sort of evolving quite fast within Judaism at the time when Christianity is emerging, they're always mixed. So you can talk about the kingdom of God would be the kind of standard way of talking about heaven, what we probably think of as heaven in early writings. So you can think of the kingdom of God as something that is coming on earth in the future, as something that is already in existence in a metaphysical realm, as something that is in existence in the metaphysical realm or wherever the power of God pertains, but is already spreading in this earth. Or in one verse in Luke, it is entos humon, it is either within you or among you, or possibly within your grasp. We're not quite sure what entos humon should be translated as, but that is at least one possibility, is that there's a strand of early thinking that thinks of heaven as quite interior. So all those possibilities are actually already are around from our earliest sources. So thinking about heaven is also very varied. So there is no sort of simple correlation between a way of thinking about faith and a way of thinking about heaven, and no single way in which they kind of change. It's more that there are multiple strands which get gradually kind of more complicated through time, and of which some writers and some parts of churches and churches as a church as a whole give more emphasis to at different times. And so that's a complicated answer, I'm afraid, but that's the best I can do probably to capture something of that complexity.
Could I ask you to elaborate perhaps on how one would test faith? And perhaps in this early period, what would a test of faith entail?
Right. Okay. So, one common way that it's talked about is endurance under suffering, or endurance under persecution, or it's not always, for very early Christians, active persecution, but it might be a bit of cold shouldering by your neighbours and possibly getting expelled from your local synagogue sort of persecution. So endurance, in an extreme situation, enduring martyrdom very stoically is seen as a great sign of faith and very inspiring. Exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit, which might be in a range of things. It might mean speaking in tongues at one extreme, or it might just be being extremely patient and temperate and self-controlled. So there's a whole range of virtues that are associated with having the Spirit. Preaching, having a gift of preaching. So again, the Spirit can be thought of as giving gifts of preaching or teaching or healing or leadership, and those can be seen as signs of faith, because it's faith that has enabled you to receive these gifts of the Spirit. So I think that Christians take a pretty elastic view of what how faith can be demonstrated. More or less anything good that can be roped in as a proof of faith. On the other hand, of course, if people who disagree with you doctrinally endure under suffering, that's not a proof of their faith. That's a proof of they're being aligned to the devil or something. So you try to have it all ways if you can. But that's a sample anyway, I think, of the range of things. Yeah.
Was pistis used within its religious context in non-Christian religious works of that same time period?
Yeah. Well, in the sense that trust in the gods is a thing that non-Christians can talk about, Jews can talk about, the faithfulness of God, using emunah language, is a big theme of the Hebrew Bible. So Christians get not so much the importance of trusting in God, although that is there in the Hebrew Bible sometimes, but particularly the faithfulness of God is an idea they get straight from the Hebrew Bible. So that kind of language, that's around in the Hebrew Bible, it's around in Judaism. Polytheists, well, they do talk about pistis and fides towards the gods. What is different in mainstream polytheism in this world is that the gods are really not regarded as very reliable. So polytheists don't so much express their trust in God or the faithfulness of God as worry about it and try to engineer it and worry that they're not succeeding. So Christians are distinctive in how much they talk about it. They talk about it much more than anybody else. And they align with Jews in expressing great confidence in the faithfulness of God and in the reliability of God when you put your trust in God. So that's a very Jewish thing. Polytheists, very worried about the whole trustworthiness issue. God's not trustworthy on the whole. Yeah.
Yeah, picking up on that, so and you're including in that, developing sort of mystery cults, and moving on into, let's say, Neoplatonism too. Is there, because you talk about, a change in the notion of fides from, trustworthiness to belief. Is there discussion among, let's say, the Neoplatonists? You mentioned origin, right? Is there discussion among the Neoplatonists that's at all just
Well, how long do we have? Well, no, not so much, interestingly. Now, Plato himself was very interested in the unreliability of belief. And what slightly changes between Plato and, say, Justin Martyr is that a lot of Plato was willing to be really quite daring religiously, and say that, the regular gods are not trustworthy either, and therefore you shouldn't really... No, well, Socrates ended up, not Plato. Plato died in his bed, despite the fact it was... Oh, you should know that. Shocked. Anyway, Socrates, who may well have been more pious than Plato, but Plato was religiously very, very daring. However, interestingly, when you get down to the generations of Middle Platonists that we know the most about, think of Cicero, he's an academic, but he's closely related to Platonism, Plutarch, paid up Middle Platonist, Philo too, of course. They actually are there's a kind of a generation in the late 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE into the 2nd century CE, couple of generations, 2-3 generations of Middle Platonists who also identify as pious regular religionists, regular polytheists. And that isn't, well, I mean, Plato would have said he was, but whether he really was is a big question. But someone like Plutarch was undoubtedly genuinely pious towards the regular polytheist gods, and so was Cicero. I just don't think there's any doubt about that, really. And they were quite interested in in finding good evidence from this world for belief. So where Plato said you can't trust the evidence of the material world at all, therefore you can't believe anything in the material world. So Plutarch or Cicero wanted to say, well, actually there are things you can believe about the gods on the basis of this material world, because they did actually want to believe in the gods as well as in knowledge and the world of forms and so on. And that's the Middle Platon. That's what Justin Martyr is picking up when he says you can prove, Christianity is believable. You can demonstrate it and believe it. And that's Justin and Clement and Origen all want to say that. And that's very Middle Platonist. Now, later Platonists, real Neoplatonists from Plotinus onwards, so we're talking about the late 3rd century into the 4th, and it's really picked up by Christians in the late 4th century. So it's the Cappadocian Fathers and then Augustine more indirectly, who are influenced by Plotinus and later Platonism. They are not so interested in belief, because they are really heavily focused on knowledge. So the Cappadocians have much less to say about pistis, about faith, belief, trust, than anyone earlier, really, and they talk far more about gnosis, about knowledge. That's what they're after, really. And where Clement and Origen would say, well, there's an ascent through belief to knowledge, Gregory of Nyssa, much less interested in the belief phases, cutting straight to the knowledge, really. So actually, people who are influenced by Neoplatonism actually have less to say about belief, interestingly.
Question in the back.
Yes, okay, yeah. One then do it back.
I'm just interested, you kind of described this, Paul turning in his grave, as a kind of a divorce then from sort of true biblical religion.
No. It's a remarkable change. I don't think I go all the way with divorce. I do think, I like relational trust. I think it makes a lot of sense to a lot of the faithful now. And as somebody who has to preach a lot of sermons on doctrine, I find it very helpful. And I think it is an interesting and an important biblical idea which is worth retaining, as it were. So I think the change from belief leading to trust leading to belief is a very dramatic change, and it's one which has had its difficulties for Christianity, because actually saying you have to believe that certain things are true, which are things that you probably won't understand as a regular member of a congregation, but tough, you have to believe it anyway. That is a really high bar, and people find it to this day a high bar, and it's a difficult thing. And given that Christians continue to argue fiercely about every aspect of doctrine, that makes the bar even higher in some ways. So I think there are things about this privileging of belief which have not always done Christianity great favours, and in some ways I think recovering the aspect of trust, of faith as trust, is quite helpful. That said, it is there and it's in the tradition. So I don't think it's a divorce from biblical thinking. I think it is. It's a considerable development from biblical thinking. But I would also point out that all the writers, the Christian writers, who were between them responsible for that development, absolutely saw themselves as in continuity with Scripture. So they didn't anyway think that they were overseeing a revolution. They thought they were drawing out implications that they were interested in from Scripture. But in the process, really changing the meaning of a key term quite dramatically. But that won't be the only thing in Christian thinking of which that's true. I mean, all sorts of, every aspect of the core Christian doctrine has evolved radically since the first generations. And I think it is helpful to us to remain conscious of the whole richness of the tradition and not to forget, the earlier strands of tradition as we develop later ones. So that's all I kind of argue for, I guess, on the theological side or on the historical side in recovering this stuff. And we do that all the time. I mean, I'm lecturing to my students in Yale the other week about patripassionism. Throughout antiquity, patripassionism was regarded by most people as an outrageous and shocking and completely unacceptable heresy. Nowadays, and particularly since the Holocaust and since the Second World War, it has become almost heretical to say God doesn't suffer. And we've had an absolute volte-face in theological thinking about patripassionism. So there are plenty of theological themes where something like that has happened at some point in history. This is one of them. But I think, knowing as much as we can about the whole richness of the tradition is a great help to us, I think. Yeah, there was a hand up at the back, I think, which I didn't see. But oh yeah, hi.
Yeah, I think you were talking about St. Lawrence was burning, his faith was not. And I see themes of it's like their bodies are like incorruptible, like these saints or martyrs. So I was wondering, what do you think that entails for the symbolism of their body surviving, or their faith surviving?
Well, yes, I don't know whether you're thinking of the martyrdom of Polycarp, which is the first really classic description of the flame. It says the flames don't engulf him, they just kind of surround him, and he's like a loaf of bread baking in the oven as he's being sort of burnt at the stake. However, at the end of that story is that his ashes and his bones are collected. So there is no suggestion that he is not burnt and reduced to bones and to ashes by that process. So martyrdoms which talk about the suffering of the faithful being taken away, it's by Christ in the case of Polycarp and by faith in the case of Lawrence, and by faith in some later martyrdoms too. That kind of creates a vision of it's a vision of how, in some sense, the faithful are transcending their suffering, I think, even during martyrdom. It is not saying anything about, for instance, the preservation of the body as against the soul. There was a debate separately about what is raised, what reaches heaven, whether it's the soul, the body, a changed body, a body changed in what way. There are a lot of debates about that. I don't know whether that's what you're pointing to, but those are separate, I think, from the martyrdom accounts, which do assume, which are kind of offering a vision in some ways of the martyr's body unaffected by suffering, and that's a statement of the strength of their faith. But it doesn't say that they're not killed and they're not reduced to ashes or whatever by the form of death. Does that make sense?
I'm sure others will have things they wish to speak to you about in the reception in the lobby outside, but I just want to thank you from the Faculty of Arts and from those of us here for this incredible sort of weaving of this tapestry of the Christian journey towards faith. I was really inspired by the connections you were making interdisciplinarily with literature and music and history and philosophy and so on. I think there's so much more in this time period that all of us will on some occasion in the future go, oh, I hadn't thought about that way. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. I may not thank you for the reference to the Holy Communion. It will never be the same. But,
Difficult story.
Yes, absolutely. But please join me in thanking Dr. Morgan for being here this evening.